out of Egypt and had come into the blessing of the promised land. And for a time, the nation lived politically under a loose confederation of clans and tribes, with occasionally one of these clan chieftains or tribal chieftains sort of taking a center place for a time, and that was called a judge. So this was called the period of the judges. So it was a loose, decentralized, no central authority in Israel in comparison with, for example, like what we have today, a federal government in this nation, highly centralized government. So Israel was a loose configuration of disorganized clans and tribes. Now, if we remember, after several generations of this, the people, we had a cycle. The people would fall away, and God would bring a judge to bring them back. The people would fall away, and there would be an enemy invasion, or there would be some economic strife or stress or some difficulty, and God would raise up a leader to bring them back to himself. Well, finally, after several cycles of this, the nation, the people of Israel, as a nation, decided that they didn't want this. They wanted a political model that matched what some of their neighbors had at that time. So this is the period here. This is the later part of this is the early part of the Iron Age time frame. And so we had these powers around the nation of Israel, and they were centralizing empires. So you had Egypt to the south and to the west of Israel. And then you had a variation. I think around this time you have the remnants of the Amorite kingdoms, and then you have what will become the Assyrian and the Babylonian empires to the north and to the west of Israel at this time. And so Samuel was the judge at this point. And when they came to Samuel and said, "We want a king," Samuel was quite offended by this, for he had thought he had been a good judge. But God told Samuel, "It's not you they're rejecting, it's me." And so God, through Samuel, appoints a king. And that king, his name was Saul. And Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. Now, Saul was ruling, and what we saw in the last chapter, God had given a command that Saul should go and wipe out the Amalekites. And this is a very offensive thing to modern sensibilities. How dare God command such a thing? Isn't this genocide? Isn't God a moral monster? Is what so many of people in today's culture will say in response to these sorts of things. I want to ask, I want to say in response, it takes one to know one. I really do want to point that out. The people who believe that it's all right to end the lives of their own offspring are now telling me and telling God that they don't approve. Surely sin is a deceiving thing. But anyway, so during this, Saul was not faithful in following God's instructions. And so because of that, God has rejected Saul as the king. And so we pick up today in 1 Samuel chapter 16. Follow along with me. The Lord was sorry he had made Saul the king of Israel. One day he said, "Samuel, I've rejected Saul, and I refuse to let him be king any longer. Stop feeling sad about him. Pour some olive oil in a small container and go visit a man named Jesse who lives in Bethlehem. I've chosen one of his sons to be my king." we need to fear God. God in the Scriptures is God of the second chance. He's God of the third chance. He's God of the fourth, fifth, sixth chance. He's God of the 2,814th chance. He's even God of the 65,336th chance. He is not the God of an unbounded number of chances. There will be a time when our disobedience is met by, okay then, we're moving on now. And we should think about that. We should thank God for His mercy. We should thank God for His thousands of chances. But we should never say to ourselves, I've got God in my hip pocket. He loves me. And that means that no matter what I do, if I get confronted with my sin, I'm just going to pull out the love card. Ha ha! Here's my get out of sin free card. God, you said you loved me. How can you punish me? Well, the simple fact is that God will and God does. And God help us. And God help me. And God help you. So God says to Samuel, that's it. I've made up my mind about Saul. And one day He will say that about you, and He will say that about me. And our time on this world will be past. And so God has said, I've chosen one of Jesse's sons to be my king. Now Samuel said, if I do that, Saul will find out and have me killed. Take a calf with you, the Lord replied. Tell everyone that you've come to offer it as a sacrifice to me. Then invite Jesse to the sacrifice. When I show you which one of his sons I have chosen, pour the olive oil on his head. Samuel did what the Lord told them and went to Bethlehem. The town leaders went to meet him, but they were terribly afraid and asked, is this a friendly visit? Yes, it is, Samuel answered. By the way, how dare we in this culture, in this nation, how dare we forget to ask that question when God or one of His messengers comes into our lives? Is this a friendly visit? We should fear God, because one day it might not be. Our sins may prompt and provoke a just response. And yet, in our nation, in our culture, we want to sin with impunity. Saul didn't get away with it. You won't get away with it. I won't get away with it. But in this case, Samuel said, yes, this is a friendly visit. I've come to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. Get yourselves ready to take part in the sacrifice and come with me. Samuel also invited Jesse and his sons to come to the sacrifice, and he got them ready to take part. Now, let's talk a little bit about why we had these sacrifices, why they were offered in this Old Testament. Because today non-believers have a very warped view of what the sacrificial system described in the Bible is about. Maybe you've played some of these God games where you get to be God, or you get to be God's captain or representative in this video game, in this world. And the way that God is pleased in this video game is if you perform actions, you go on quests, you capture, you fulfill whatever those quests require, and then you come back and you get, divine favors. Or you go and get worshipers, you bring them back to God, and just like a car salesman, you get a little commission. This is how the world thinks of the sacrificial system, and this is one of the reasons why they call him a moral monster. Why does God need to be worshipped? Why does he need money? Does he need favors? Does he need his ego stroked? Is what some of them will say. Well, here's the answer. The sacrificial system was given not because God needed divine goodies, divine num-nums to satisfy his insatiable appetite for worship. Rather, God gave the sacrificial system as a picture to tell the people what he would one day do on our behalf. And so, this is a great honor. This was never about, I am a God who has to have 10,000 bulls, or otherwise I might just rampage, because you know I do those things. This is about a God who said, this sin situation is so serious that one day I myself will send a sacrifice. And this sacrifice will be perfect. And by the blood of this sacrifice will many people be brought back into the right relationship with God. So anyway, let's go back into verse 6. When Jesse and his sons arrived, Samuel noticed that Jesse's oldest son, Eliab, was there. He has to be the one the Lord has chosen, Samuel said to himself. But the Lord told him, Samuel, don't think Eliab is the one just because he's tall and handsome. He isn't the one I've chosen. People judge others by what they look like, but I judge people by what is in their hearts. Jesse told his son Abinadab to go over to Samuel. But Samuel said, no, the Lord hasn't chosen him. Then Jesse sent Shammah to him. And Samuel said, Jesse had all 7 of his sons go over to Samuel. Finally Samuel said, Jesse, the Lord hasn't chosen any of these young men. Do you have any more sons? And Jesse says, yes. With the implication here being, well, yes, I've got that worthless nothing out in the field who is not even worth bringing to this gathering. That's how little Jesse thought of him. Send for him, Samuel said. We won't start the ceremony until he gets here. I want to just take a point here. You know, a lot of times Jesse is sort of called out as being the root by which David, the shoot of Jesse, has come forth. And it's sort of commendable, like Jesse was this wonderful man. Jesse thought so little of his son that he didn't even bother to have him attend when the prophet of God came by to offer a sacrifice. Wow. It was a nothing. You hear all the time about parents telling children, you'll never amount to nothing. You will never be anything. You're worthless. You're a no good for nothing nobody. My friends, parents tell their children that all the time. But God was going to show Jesse something. So Jesse sent for David. He was a healthy, good-looking boy with a sparkle in his eyes. As soon as David came, the Lord told Samuel, he's the one, get up and pour oil on his head. Samuel poured the oil on David's head while his brothers watched. At that moment, the Spirit of the Lord took control of David and stayed with him from then on. Samuel returned home to Ramah. Now, by the way, this is a figure, or this is a picture of a coronation. This is an anointing, which is not quite the same as a coronation, but this is the investiture of David. This is the external recognition or picture of what God has already purposed to do. So there was nothing special in this oil or in this ceremony. It was an external, visible token or sign or way to see from an external view what God had already internally decided. And so this is a new king being anointed and coronated. And guess what? That's normally not an issue in a land, except in the situation where you already have a king who still thinks he's the one on the throne. So you see the danger Samuel's in. You see the danger that David and that Jesse and his family are in. However, let's continue on. Verse 14. The Spirit of the Lord had left Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord was terrifying him. Saul's officials said, "It's an evil spirit from God that's frightening you. Your Majesty, let us go and look for someone who is good at playing the harp. He can play for you whenever the evil spirit from God bothers you, and you'll feel better." "All right," Saul answered. "Find me someone who is good at playing the harp and bring him here." "A man named Jesse, who lives in Bethlehem, has a son who can play the harp," one official said. "He's a brave warrior. He's good looking. He can speak well, and the Lord is with him." Let's pause for just a moment. Hello? Wake up. What are the odds that the official, we need a harp player. What are the odds that some official just randomly said, there's that David boy I know about. Does this look like randomness to you? Well, to today's secular world, it looks random. One official just says, I just happen to know of every citizen in the entire nation, there's that boy Jesse. He plays the harp. He plays it well. Here's my point. What looks like randomness to people who don't know God is the very providence of God acting. And so the official said, he's a brave warrior, good looking, he can speak well, the Lord is with him. You know, not just anybody gets into the king's palace. You know, if you're a schlep, if you don't look good, if you don't take care of yourself, if you don't have great hygiene, if you have no regard for your appearance and how you present yourself, if you got BO, the king don't want to be around BO. Come on, he's the king. Don't offend his delicate nosebuds. Anyway, so Saul sent a message to Jesse. Please tell your son David to leave your sheep and come here to me. Jesse loaded a donkey with bread and a goat skin full of wine, and he told David to take the donkey and young goat to Saul. David went to Saul and started working for him. By the way, why? Why does Jesse tell David to take a donkey and a young goat? He's called for you. By the way, take the donkey and young goat. How does it work in the world? Powerful people don't just want to be approached by random people, even the ones they've asked for. From Jesse's point of view, when a powerful person wants something, am I in trouble? Is something going on? So what practice or habit do you get into when powerful people summon you or your family members? You're like, okay, what did I do? Am I in trouble? I know. Send him a gift. Take him some money. Take him, in this case, a donkey and a goat. Don't go before the king empty-handed. Hello? You know, we talk today. People think about and read the scriptures and don't understand always the social relationships between people. You know, not only didn't just anyone go into the king's palace, but in general, powerful people were powerful because if you didn't bring them gifts, things happened to you. which were not generally nice. So David went to Saul and started working for him. Saul liked him so much that he put David in charge of carrying his weapons. What does that mean? That means basically David is sort of like a what's the military, I think, adjutant? Is that the right word? So an assistant who helps the general, or who helps the king, or helps the high official. You know, he's like a gopher for him. You mentioned gopher earlier. You know, David's kind of like a gopher, and so the king has like a cadre of young men, a retinue of young men who are there to fulfill this task. Hey, the king needs this. You, go get him that. Oh, the king needs that. You, go get him. The king needs you to go talk to somebody and say such and such from him. Boom. And he would send these messages. So David was one of Saul's personal assistants. And so not long after this, verse 22, Saul sent another message to Jesse. I really like David. Please let him stay with me. Whenever the evil spirit from God bothered Saul, David would play his harp. Saul would relax and feel better, and the evil spirit would go away. The stage is set. We should fear God, brothers, because God is worthy to be feared. Saul is still on the throne, and he's still making his plans, but God has already moved on. And so everything that happens from here is just the outworking of what God had already decided. Meanwhile, Saul doesn't even necessarily realize this. If Saul did realize it, what could he have even done? Well, for one thing, he could have returned back to God. He could have come back and said, "Oh God, I have sinned against you." Where did this idea come from that kings are supposed to have this sort of absolutist authority? Now, I mean human kings. Well, the idea came from it. The idea came from the fact that when people tend to be given power, they very rarely go backward. Power accrues more power, and there's something seductive about it. What's the old saying, the famous saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And as I like to remind folks, even relative power will do the trick. And so we see people possessing power and find out that unless God is in it, the power ends up possessing you. The wretchedness and the depravity of the human condition is such that sometimes receiving a gift of a thing, if it gives you more power than you can bear, is a curse. What have we learned about, so many lottery winners? Many people win the lottery or win substantial jackpots. And in many cases, they're able to steward those winnings well. But in a lot of cases, those jackpots can be thought of in an ultimate sense as much of a curse as a blessing. And so here it is. Saul is starting this downward spiral. God has already moved on, but the trajectory that Saul is in, the spiraling out, will take several years to actually complete. And that should be something for you and something for me to think about. When something positive happens, we shouldn't just think to ourselves, oh, because it's new on our radar, that God hadn't thought of this many years earlier. And God hasn't been preparing things. So the point I want to make is this. In God's sovereignty, God is preparing things on He's playing the long game. The time frame for his decisions is not just days or hours, as it often is in our own sense, but years and generations, and even eternity. So, we've got a situation arising, we've got this transition happening. We're going to take a look at more of that in the next session. Okay, do you still have your hymnals?